You feel the telephone receiver cold against your ear, the bakelite smooth and heavy like holding a stone pulled from deep water. The voice on the other end is mechanical, distant, filtered through hundreds of kilometers of wire that stretch back to Berlin, back to the Reich Chancellery, back to the bunker where decisions are made by men who no longer see cities as places where people live, but as chess pieces to be sacrificed in games already lost. The order is simple, delivered in clipped German that leaves no room for interpretation. Paris must not fall into enemy hands intact. If the city cannot be held, it must be destroyed. Your name is Dietrich von Choltitz, and you are 50 years old, and you have been a soldier for longer than you can remember being anything else. General der Infanterie, they call you, the military governor of Gross Paris, commander of the German garrison in a city you've occupied for 4 years, but never truly possessed. You stand in your office at the Hôtel Maurice on the Rue de Rivoli, looking out over the Tuileries garden, where the August heat shimmers above the gravel paths, where Parisians still walk despite the curfews and the shortages and the knowledge that liberation or annihilation approaches with equal certainty. The date is August 23rd, 1944, and the Americans are at the gates. The French resistance has risen inside the city, barricades appearing overnight like mushrooms after rain, cobblestones torn from ancient streets to build walls that won't stop tanks but represent something more dangerous than physical barriers. You have 20,000 troops under your command, though many are already slipping away, changing into civilian clothes, melting into the population like ice into water. You have tanks, artillery, enough explosive charges beneath the city's bridges to drop them all into the Seine like broken teeth. The list sits on your desk, typewritten in neat rows that reduce architectural magnificence to target coordinates. The Eiffel Tower, charges placed at base supports, estimated tons of explosive required, detonation sequence. Notre Dame Cathedral, supports weakened, incendiary devices positioned in roof structure, backup conventional explosives. The Louvre, multiple charges throughout galleries, special attention to load-bearing walls. Les Invalides, the Panthéon, the Palais Garnier, the Arc de Triomphe. 300 targets in total, each one marked for destruction, each one representing centuries of human achievement scheduled for erasure. You have destroyed cities before. Rotterdam burned at your command in 1940, though you tell yourself the fires spread beyond what was intended, that civilian casualties were unfortunate but unavoidable in the prosecution of war. Sevastopol fell after a siege you helped orchestrate, the city reduced to rubble so complete that maps became obsolete, streets disappearing beneath tons of shattered concrete and broken lives. You followed orders then, because orders were the architecture of your existence, the framework that allowed you to function without the paralysis that comes from thinking too deeply about consequences. But Paris is different. You've walked these streets in the early mornings when the city wakes slowly, when the smell of baking bread drifts from boulangeries that somehow still operate despite flour shortages, when old men sit in cafes nursing single cups of ersatz coffee because the ritual matters more than the substance. You've seen the bookstalls along the Seine, the vendors who arrange their wares with the same care jewelers use displaying diamonds. You've stood in the cathedral of Notre Dame when no one else was there, looking up at the rose windows that filter light into colors that seem impossible, that transforms stone and glass into something approaching transcendence. Your aide brings you reports throughout the day. The Swedish consul, Raoul Nordling, requests an audience, his third attempt this week. The French resistance commander wants to negotiate a ceasefire. Your own officers are asking for clarification, their faces showing the strain of men who understand the difference between military necessity and cultural apocalypse. The telephone rings again, Berlin demanding confirmation that preparations are complete, that you understand the Führer's order is absolute, that Paris must become a field of ruins rather than fall intact into enemy hands. You remember your family estate in Baden, the library where your father kept books collected over generations, first editions and rare manuscripts arranged with the reverence some men reserve for religious icons. You remember him explaining that civilization is not inevitable, that it must be actively preserved against the forces that seek to reduce everything to the lowest common denominator of violence and survival. You thought he was old-fashioned, sentimental, that modern war had no room for such considerations. The sun sets over Paris, and the city glows golden in that particular light that painters have tried to capture for centuries without ever quite succeeding. From your window you can see the dome of Les Invalides, where Napoleon's tomb sits beneath layers of marble and history. You can see ordinary Parisians hurrying home before curfew, mothers holding children's hands, old women carrying string bags with whatever food they manage to find. They don't know that beneath their feet, beneath their beloved monuments, beneath the bridges they cross without thinking, lie enough explosives to erase their city from the earth. You pour yourself a cognac from a bottle you confiscated from the hotel's cellar, French cognac that's older than you are, that survived one world war only to face destruction in another. The liquid burns smooth down your throat, and you think about legacy, about how men are remembered, about whether following orders absolves you of responsibility or compounds it. You've built a career on obedience, on executing commands without the luxury of moral hesitation. But standing here now, you understand that some orders test whether you're a soldier or simply a mechanism, whether you retain enough humanity to recognize when the machine you serve has become monstrous. Nordling arrives at midnight, permitted entry because you've decided protocols matter less than conversations. He's a slight man, balding, with the kind of face that inspires confidence through its very ordinariness. He doesn't plead or threaten. Instead, he talks about his children, about walking them through the Luxembourg gardens, about the responsibility each generation has to preserve beauty for the next. He talks about how destruction is easy, how any fool with enough explosives can reduce magnificence to rubble, but that creation requires something rarer, requires the courage to choose preservation over the easier path of annihilation. You don't sleep that night. You walk through the hotel's empty corridors, past rooms that once housed aristocrats and artists and lovers who never imagined these walls would someday shelter men planning the city's destruction. You find yourself in the lobby, looking at a chandelier that catches moonlight through the windows, scattering it across marble floors in patterns that shift with each small movement of air. Someone created this. Someone designed and built and installed this object of beauty, not because it was necessary, but because humans sometimes choose to make the world more beautiful than it needs to be. Dawn comes, August 24th, 1944, and another telephone call from Berlin. The voice is different this time, higher ranked, more insistent. The Americans and French forces are entering the city's outskirts. The order is given again, with emphasis, with the implicit threat that disobedience means dishonor, court-martial, execution for treason. You're told that the Führer himself is waiting for confirmation that Paris burns, that if the Reich cannot have the city, no one will, that your legacy depends on following orders without the weakness of sentiment.
You walk to your desk and pick up the detonation orders, the papers that would set in motion a sequence of explosions designed to topple monuments that have stood for centuries. Your signature is required on each page, the final authorization before engineers press the plungers that will send electrical current through wires to charges packed around stone and steel. Your hand holds the pen, and for a moment the weight of that pen feels unbearable, as if it contains all the compressed gravity of history waiting to tip one direction or another. Instead, you pick up the telephone and call your chief engineer. You tell him to disconnect the detonation circuits. You tell him to remove the charges from the bridges, to defuse the explosives in the monuments, to ignore any orders that don't come directly from you, regardless of their claimed origin. His voice on the other end is quiet, uncertain, asking for confirmation because such an order contradicts everything coming from Berlin. You confirm it. You make it explicit. Paris will not burn. The French resistance commander arrives under a flag of truce, a young man named Rol Tanguy, who looks barely old enough to shave, but whose eyes carry the weight of years spent fighting from the shadows. You negotiate a ceasefire, not because you believe it will hold for long, but because it buys time, because every hour that passes without detonations is an hour where the decision becomes harder to reverse. You're stalling, you realize, using bureaucratic delays and procedural complications to run out the clock on your own orders. August 25th arrives with church bells ringing across the city, bells that have been silent for 4 years suddenly finding their voices again. You can hear gunfire in the distance, sporadic at first, then building to a sustained crackle as French and American forces push into the city proper. Your garrison is collapsing, units surrendering or fleeing or simply vanishing into the urban landscape. You remain in the Hotel Meurice because running seems pointless, because you've made your choice and now must live with whatever consequences follow. The French arrive at your headquarters just after noon. General Philippe Leclerc, commander of the French 2nd Armored Division, his uniform dusty from the road, his face showing the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from years of exile and hope deferred, finally reaching fruition. You accept your surrender with formality that borders on coldness, the paperwork signed in silence, your pistol handed over with the ritual that marks the end of your authority. They take you through the streets and you see Paris intact. The bridges still span the Seine, their stone arches reflecting in water that flows as it has flowed for millennia. Notre Dame still rises above the Île de la Cité, its towers reaching toward a sky now free of German flags. The Eiffel Tower still stands, its iron lattice catching the afternoon sun, still the most recognizable silhouette in a city that remains recognizable. People crowd the sidewalks, some cheering, some crying,
some simply standing in stunned silence as if they can't quite believe their city survived. You will spend the next years in prison, testifying at Nuremberg, trying to explain decisions that seem simultaneously obvious and impossible. You will be vilified by some for the destructions you did carry out in other cities, lionized by others for the destruction you prevented in this one. The truth, you will come to understand, is more complicated than either narrative allows, that you were both perpetrator and savior, that the same capacity for obedience that enabled atrocities also enabled preservation when you finally chose to disobey. But in this moment, being driven through liberated Paris in the back of a military vehicle, you look out at the city you were ordered to destroy and chose to save. You see children playing in parks that were scheduled to become craters. You see old men at cafe tables that were meant to be buried under rubble. You see the monuments that should be smoking ruins instead standing solid and beautiful and utterly indifferent to how close they came to annihilation. The question will haunt you for the rest of your life. Why did you disobey? Was it conscience finally asserting itself after years of suppression? Was it pragmatism, recognizing that destroying Paris served no military purpose and would only guarantee your condemnation by history? Was it simply exhaustion, the accumulated weight of orders followed and cities destroyed, finally becoming too heavy to bear? You will never have a satisfactory answer, because human decisions rarely reduce to single causes, because the moment of choice contained multitudes of motivations too tangled to separate cleanly. What you know with certainty is that some orders test whether you remain human or have become merely a function of the machine that issues commands. You know that following orders can be the path of least resistance, even when it leads to monstrous outcomes, and that disobedience requires a courage different from battlefield bravery, requires the willingness to stand alone against the entire architecture of authority and duty and habit that defines your identity. Paris endures because you chose to let it endure. The bridges carry traffic across the Seine because you ordered the charges removed. The cathedral bells ring because you refused to silence them permanently. Civilization persists not because it's inevitable, but because individuals sometimes choose preservation over destruction, even when destruction is easier, even when obedience demands annihilation. You are Dietrich von Koltitz, and you saved a city by disobeying, and that paradox will define you more completely than all the battles you won or orders you followed. History will argue about your motives, will debate whether you deserve credit for preserving what you had no right to threaten in the first place. But the city stands, and within it millions of lives continue. And sometimes the most important thing a man can do is recognize when his orders require him to become something he cannot bear to be. The afternoon light catches the Seine as your vehicle crosses a bridge that should have fallen, and for just a moment you allow yourself to feel something like peace, knowing that whatever judgment awaits, whatever price you'll pay for disobedience, Paris will still be here, still beautiful, still standing as proof that the human capacity for preservation can sometimes overcome the human capacity for destruction. You wake on the morning of August 23rd, 1944, and the weight settles on your chest before you even open your eyes.
a pressure that has nothing to do with the summer heat already gathering in your room at the Hotel Maurice. The sheets beneath you are damp with sweat, not from temperature, but from dreams you can't quite remember, fragments of cities burning, of orders given and followed, of consequences that pile up like bodies after a bombardment, until the sheer mass becomes impossible to see over or around. The mirror shows you a face you barely recognize anymore. 50 years old, but you look older, the lines around your eyes carved deep by years of squinting through smoke and dust, by nights without sleep, by the accumulation of decisions that seemed necessary at the time, but that revisit you now in quiet moments with their full weight exposed. Your uniform hangs on the chair where you left it, perfectly pressed, because standards must be maintained even as everything else collapses, even as the empire you've served fragments into desperate enclaves, defending ground that's already lost. Breakfast arrives on a silver tray brought by hotel staff who moved through their routines with the mechanical precision of people who have learned that survival sometimes means pretending normalcy while the world burns. Coffee, real coffee somehow, not the ersatz mixture most of Paris drinks now. Fresh bread, which means someone still operates a bakery despite flour shortages, despite the knowledge that the liberation everyone whispers about could arrive today or tomorrow or next week. You eat without tasting, fuel for a body that must keep functioning regardless of appetite. The reports pile on your desk in neat stacks, organized by priority and threat level. American forces are 40 kilometers west and closing. The French 2nd Armored Division approaches from the south. Inside the city, resistance cells grow bolder, their attacks more frequent and coordinated, targeting supply convoys and communication lines and isolated patrols. Your garrison bleeds strength daily, men deserting or requesting transfers or simply disappearing into the vast anonymous spaces a city provides for those who wish to vanish. Your chief of staff brings the latest inventory of prepared demolitions, every bridge across the Seine rigged with enough explosive to drop the spans into the river. The Eiffel Tower's base supports packed with charges calculated to bring the entire structure down in a controlled collapse. Notre Dame wired with incendiaries in the roof timbers and conventional explosives at structural points. The Louvre, the Palais Bourbon, the Opera Garnier, all prepared for destruction with the thoroughness German military engineering brings to every task, whether construction or annihilation. You walk through the hotel corridors and find yourself descending to street level, stepping out into morning air that smells of diesel exhaust and something sweeter, chestnuts roasting at a cart operated by an old man who seems utterly unconcerned with the military vehicles rumbling past. Parisians hurry along the sidewalks, their faces showing the particular strain of people living in the gap between occupation ending and liberation beginning, that dangerous space where anything might happen, and frequently does. The city stretches around you in all directions, 700 years of accumulated human achievement compressed into 105 square kilometers of streets and buildings and parks and monuments. You've studied the statistics because understanding a place requires knowing its dimensions. 2 million inhabitants, though many fled before the occupation and more have left since. 15,000 streets, each one named for someone or something, history layered over history, until the very act of walking becomes a journey through time.
6,000 buildings officially classified as historical monuments, though that number seems meaningless when you consider that almost every structure holds some story, some connection to the vast web of human experience this place represents. Your morning inspection takes you past the Tuileries Garden, where despite everything people still walk, mothers pushing prams, old men sitting on benches feeding pigeons from hoarded bread. The palace that once stood here burned in 1871 during the Paris Commune. The ruins finally cleared in 1883, but the gardens remain, geometric and formal in the French style, nature-controlled and shaped but not eliminated, coexistence rather than conquest. A young Wehrmacht private stands guard at an intersection, barely 18, his rifle held with the awkward tension of someone still not entirely comfortable with the weapon's weight. You salute him as you pass, his face showing relief that a senior officer noticed him, acknowledged his existence in this vast machinery of war, where individual soldiers are interchangeable parts. You remember being that young, being certain that orders made sense and authority deserved obedience and the cause justified the means. The telephone call from Berlin comes at 1100 hours, routed through multiple exchanges, the connection crackling with static and the ghosts of other conversations bleeding through the wires. The voice belongs to General Jodl, Chief of Operations, speaking with the clipped precision that characterizes all communication from the high command now, every word measured and weighted, because telephone lines might be compromised and nothing can be wasted on pleasantries or uncertainty. You stand at your window after the call ends, looking out at a city that seems to shimmer in the heat, the buildings wavering as if already beginning to dissolve. The architectural marvel of Paris took centuries to create, generations of builders and artists and planners, each adding their contribution to an evolving masterpiece. The bridges alone represent engineering achievements spanning from medieval times through the Industrial Revolution, each one reflecting the aesthetic and technical capabilities of its era. Notre Dame required 200 years to complete, the cathedral's construction beginning in 1163 and finishing in 1345. Countless stonemasons and carpenters and glaziers dedicating their entire working lives to a structure they knew they'd never see completed. The weight of this knowledge presses down, and you find yourself calculating in ways you never learned in military academies. How many man-hours does a city represent? How many individual acts of creation, of craft, of care? How do you measure the value of beauty against the demands of strategy? The questions have no answers within the framework of military thinking, which is perhaps why military thinking seems suddenly inadequate for the decision you face. Nordling returns in the afternoon. The Swedish consul used persistence you initially found irritating but have come to respect. He brings no new arguments, only the same truths repeated with the patience of someone who understands that changing minds requires wearing down resistance gradually, like water shaping stone. He talks about proportionality, about the fact that destroying Paris serves no military objective that justifies the cultural cost. He reminds you that the war is already lost, that destroying the city won't change the outcome, will only ensure that history remembers you as the man who obliterated one of humanity's greatest achievements out of spite or blind obedience. You find yourself telling him things you haven't articulated even to yourself. You talk about Rotterdam, about how the city burned beyond what was intended, about how you've told yourself for 4 years that those civilian deaths were unavoidable collateral damage, but knowing somewhere deeper that you simply followed orders without interrogating whether the orders deserved to be followed. You talk about Sevastopol, about the siege that reduced a vibrant port to wasteland, about how military success felt hollow when achieved through such comprehensive destruction.
He listens without judgment, this diplomat whose job requires understanding that people are complicated, that the same individual can contain both the capacity for destruction and the possibility of preservation. He doesn't absolve you of past actions, but suggests that what you do next matters more than what you've already done, that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about choosing different futures. Evening settles over Paris with that particular quality of light that photographers and painters chase, the sun at an angle that turns the Seine into liquid gold and makes the limestone buildings glow warm against darkening sky. You walk alone through the hotel's upper floors, rooms that once hosted royalty and celebrities and ordinary travelers who came to Paris because the city represented something larger than itself, represented the human capacity to create spaces of beauty and learning and culture. The detonation plans sit on your desk, each page requiring your signature, your authorization, your acceptance of responsibility. The military logic is airtight within its own terms. Destroy the bridges to impede enemy movement. Destroy the monuments because their symbolic value makes them legitimate targets. Destroy the infrastructure because anything left intact aids the enemy's advance. The logic closes perfectly on itself, hermetically sealed against considerations that exist outside purely military calculations. But you've seen enough war to know that military logic often fails to account for realities that don't fit neatly into tactical categories. You've seen how destroying a city doesn't just eliminate its military utility, but creates a wasteland that both sides must eventually deal with, how the cost of reconstruction often exceeds any temporary advantage gained through denial. You've seen how certain actions, once taken, cannot be undone, how some choices echo through decades in ways impossible to predict in the moment of decision. Your aide brings dinner, another surreal moment of normalcy, roasted chicken and vegetables arranged on fine china that survived German occupation only to potentially be buried in rubble if you sign the papers waiting for your authorization. You eat slowly, deliberately, aware that every minute that passes without those signatures is a minute where the city remains intact, where possibility remains open. The night deepens and Paris transforms. The blackout regulations, meaning the city that's famous for its lights, now sits in darkness, punctuated only by occasional searchlight beams and the headlamps of military vehicles. Yet even in darkness, the city persists. You can feel it around you. Millions of individual lives continuing in apartments and houses, people sleeping or lying awake, worrying about tomorrow, children dreaming whatever children dream, regardless of war, old couples holding hands in the dark and remembering better times. Somewhere in this city right now, a mother rocks a crying infant. Somewhere a baker prepares dough for tomorrow's bread, even though tomorrow might bring liberation or bombardment or both. Somewhere lovers meet in secret, their desire persisting, despite or perhaps because of the uncertainty that surrounds everything.
Somewhere an old man sits alone with memories of a wife gone 10 years, of children scattered across France, of a life lived in this city through peace and war and occupation and whatever comes next. These people don't appear in your operational reports. They're not marked on the tactical maps that show troop positions and defensive lines and strategic objectives. The orders from Berlin don't account for their existence except as obstacles or collateral damage or population to be controlled. But they exist nonetheless, 2 million individual souls whose lives will end or continue based on whether you sign papers authorizing their city's destruction. You think about your own family, about your wife and children safe in Baden, about how you'd feel if someone with the power to destroy your home, your history, your accumulated life simply followed orders without considering what those orders meant in human terms. The empathy comes late, perhaps too late to matter for Rotterdam or Sevastopol, but it comes nonetheless. The recognition that the people in this city are not fundamentally different from the people you love, that their lives have the same value, the same weight, the same claim to preservation.
You stand at the window as dawn breaks on August 24, watching the city emerge from darkness like a photograph developing in chemicals, details resolving slowly from shadow into form. The rooftops of Paris stretch endlessly in all directions, mansard angles and zinc cladding catching the first light. Centuries of architectural evolution creating a skyline that feels organic rather than planned, as if the city grew rather than was built. Somewhere out there beyond your vision, the Allied forces gather strength for their final push, and somewhere in the streets below, the resistance prepares for uprising. And here in this commandeered hotel, you occupy the shrinking space between collapse and decision. The morning briefing brings news that makes your staff officers exchange worried glances. 3 more companies deserted during the night, simply melting away into the city or stripping off uniforms and attempting to blend into the civilian population. The telephone lines to Berlin experience mysterious interruptions, technical difficulties that your communications officer reports with a studied neutrality that suggests the difficulties might not be entirely technical. Your chief engineer arrives with updates on the demolition preparations, a methodical man named Hoffman who approaches destruction with the same precision he once brought to construction projects. He reports that all primary targets remain ready for detonation, charges positioned and tested, electrical circuits verified, backup systems in place in case primary methods fail. He speaks without emotion, presenting facts and figures, tons of explosive and estimated blast radii, and projected timelines for sequential detonations designed to maximize structural collapse. You ask him a question you've never asked before, something outside the operational parameters that usually define your interactions. You ask if he's ever been to the top of the Eiffel Tower, if he stood on the observation platform and looked out over the city below like a living map. He seems surprised by the question, takes a moment before answering that yes, once, shortly after arriving in Paris, he went up with his wife who came to visit before travel became too difficult. He describes the view with unexpected poetry for an engineer, talks about how the city makes sense from that height, how you can see the logic of its growth, the way the Seine curves through like an artery carrying life. You dismiss him without signing the authorization he came for, telling him you need to review the plans one more time, a delay tactic you both recognize but neither acknowledges directly.
He leaves the folder on your desk, inches thick with technical specifications and target coordinates and careful calculations of how to most efficiently erase centuries of human achievement. A courier arrives from the Swedish consulate with a handwritten note from Nordling. The message is brief, just a few lines suggesting that history judges men not by the orders they receive, but by the orders they refuse. That courage sometimes means standing alone against the machinery of power. That the right choice is often the hardest choice. The note includes no specific recommendations, no explicit plea to spare the city, just these observations offered for your consideration. You walk through the hotel's ground floor and step outside without telling your staff where you're going, needing movement and air and distance from the weight accumulating in your office. Your guards scramble to follow, maintaining the required security perimeter, but you ignore them and walk with purpose toward the Seine. The morning is already warm, promising another day of August heat that will make uniforms uncomfortable and tempers short, that will bake the city until the stones themselves seem to exhale warmth. The Pont Alexandre III spans the river ahead, arguably the most ornate bridge in Paris, its Art Nouveau lampposts and golden statues representing the alliance between France and Russia at the turn of the century. The bridge opened in 1900 for the World's Fair, designed to be beautiful rather than merely functional, an expression of optimism about the new century and the possibility of peace through international cooperation. 44 years later, you stand looking at explosive charges attached to its supports, modern efficiency preparing to undo Belle Epoque artistry. An old woman crosses the bridge carrying a shopping bag, her pace slow but steady, her face showing the kind of determination that comes from living through 2 world wars and whatever else history threw at her. She doesn't look at you despite the uniform that marks you as enemy and occupier, simply continues her journey as if German generals are no more remarkable than weather, something to endure rather than acknowledge. You find yourself following her at a distance, curious where she's going, what errand could be important enough to venture out during these dangerous transition days. She turns onto the Rue de Varennes, then into a small cemetery you didn't know existed, one of those pocket spaces Paris hides throughout its arrondissement, intimate and overgrown with ivy climbing the old walls. She stops at a grave, places flowers from her bag, stands for a moment with her head bowed before turning to leave. She sees you on her way out, meets your eyes directly for the first time, and her expression contains no fear or hatred, just a kind of tired recognition, as if she's seen enough of history's actors to know that uniforms and ranks are temporary, but grief and memory persist. You nod slightly, acknowledging her presence the way one acknowledges a fellow traveler on a long journey, then continues past toward whatever else her day requires. The grave she visited belongs to someone named Jean-Baptiste, the dates indicating he died in 1916, probably at Verdun or the Somme, or one of the other grinding battles that consumed a generation. The flowers are wild flowers, nothing expensive or elaborate, just blooms gathered somewhere and offered to memory. You calculate quickly and realize the woman is probably her widow, that she's been making this journey for 28 years, that her faithfulness to his memory outlasted the peace that followed his war and continued through the occupation of the city he died defending. The thought arrives fully formed, undeniable in its clarity. If you destroy Paris, you destroy this cemetery and this grave and this woman's 28 years of remembrance. You destroy not just buildings and bridges, but the accumulated layers of human connection that give those structures meaning, the countless individual stories woven through the city's fabric, until separating them becomes impossible. You walk further, entering neighborhoods your military maps reduce to grid coordinates and tactical positions, but which reveal themselves as communities when experienced at ground level. A butcher shop with almost nothing in the window, but still open, the proprietor sweeping his floor with the same care he'd use if the shelves were full. A bookstore with volumes arranged in the window, Shakespeare and Balzac and Proust available for anyone with money and interest, despite occupation and shortage. A small park where children play under the watchful eyes of mothers who've learned to find normalcy in abnormal times, their laughter carrying across the grass like bells. The children are too young to remember Paris before the war. This is the only version of the city they've known, occupied and restricted and dangerous. Yet they play with the same abandon children have always played with, improvising games with whatever materials they find, creating joy from circumstances that should preclude it. One boy has a toy soldier, German, probably scavenged from somewhere, and he's making it fight against a stick that represents something else, his imagination transforming random objects into epic narratives. You watch for longer than you should, your guards growing visibly nervous about remaining in one location, about the potential for resistant snipers or simply hostile crowds. But you need to see this, need to understand what destroying Paris actually means in concrete terms, not just abstract terms. It means this boy's game ends permanently. It means these mothers' careful preservation of routine collapses. It means the butcher shop and the bookstore and the cemetery and 10,000 other small spaces of human persistence disappear into rubble. Berlin calls again at noon, the connection clearer this time, Yodel's voice sharp with impatience, demanding to know why the demolitions haven't commenced, why you're delaying implementation of direct orders from the Führer himself. You provide excuses about timing and coordination.
Your aide interrupts to inform you that the resistance has requested another meeting, that their commander wants to discuss terms for avoiding bloodshed during the transition of power. The request is absurd from a purely military standpoint. You don't negotiate with insurgents who have no authority to offer terms. But you find yourself agreeing to the meeting, partly because it delays other decisions, and partly because you're curious to meet the men who fought from the shadows for years, while you fought from positions of official power. The resistance commander arrives under white flag, a young Frenchman named Raoul Tanguy, whose eyes carry the kind of conviction that comes from fighting for something rather than simply following orders. He speaks directly, without the diplomatic niceties Nordling employs, telling you bluntly that Paris will be liberated within days regardless of what you do, that the only question is how much blood gets spilled and how much of the city survives. He tells you that destroying Paris won't change the war's outcome, won't slow the Allied advance, won't provide any strategic advantage beyond denying the Allies a symbolic victory. He tells you that history will remember you as either the man who preserved Paris or the man who destroyed it, that you still have the power to choose which legacy you leave. His arguments aren't new, but coming from this young fighter who's risked everything for his city, they carry a weight that strategic briefings lack. You ask him why he fights, what makes the resistance continue despite overwhelming odds and constant danger. He looks at you as if the question reveals a fundamental misunderstanding, then gestures toward the window, toward Paris beyond. He fights because this is his city,
his home, his history, and his future. He fights because some things matter more than survival, because the human spirit requires beauty and culture and the accumulated achievements that places like Paris represent. After he leaves, you stand alone in your office as afternoon fades toward evening, the light changing again, the city transforming as it does every day, regardless of war or occupation or the decisions being made in commandeered hotels. You realize that you've been thinking about this choice incorrectly, framing it as whether to obey or disobey orders, whether to follow duty or follow conscience, as if those were the only relevant considerations. The real question is simpler and harder. What kind of man do you want to be? Not what kind of soldier, not what kind of German, not what role history will assign you, but at the deepest level, what do you choose when stripped of rank and duty and the protective cover that following orders provides? Do you choose destruction because it's easier, because it's expected, because machines run smoothly when components function as designed? Or do you choose preservation despite the cost, despite the consequences, despite how it contradicts everything your training insisted matters?
You sleep badly that night, the few hours of unconsciousness filled with images that blur together until you can't distinguish memory from imagination, from premonition. You see Rotterdam burning, the flames reflecting off low clouds until the entire sky glows orange. But when you look closer, the burning city transforms into Paris, Notre Dame's spire collapsing in slow motion, the Eiffel Tower folding in on itself like a dying insect. You wake repeatedly, each time disoriented, needing moments to remember where you are and what decision waits for you with the morning. Dawn on August 25th arrives with the sound of distant artillery, closer than yesterday, close enough that you can distinguish individual impacts rather than just a general rumble. The American and French forces are no longer approaching, they are arriving, and your intelligence reports indicate that elements of Leclerc's division have already penetrated the outer arrondissements. The window for decision is closing. Soon events will overtake choice, and the question of what you intended becomes irrelevant against the reality of what happens. Your staff assembles for what everyone understands might be the final briefing. Officers who served with you through campaigns in Poland and France and Russia. Men whose faces show the accumulated strain of years spent executing orders that grew progressively more desperate as the war turned against the Reich. They wait for instructions, for clarity about how these final hours will unfold, whether Paris will burn or surrender, whether you'll fight for every street or negotiate some face-saving withdrawal. You look at these men and see reflections of yourself, soldiers who joined to serve their country and found themselves serving something darker, who believed in victory and honor and sacrifice, but discovered those concepts become hollow when applied to unjust causes. Some of them still believe, still maintain the fiction that following orders absolves them of responsibility for outcomes. Others show doubt in their eyes, questions they don't voice because voicing them means confronting truths easier left unexamined. The telephone rings, and everyone in the room tenses, knowing it's Berlin calling again, knowing this time there will be no patience for delays or excuses. You let it ring 4 times before answering, each ring feeling like a countdown. Each moment before you pick up the receiver, a small rebellion against the inevitability others have decided for you.
The voice belongs to Field Marshal Model, commander of forces in the West, a true believer who still speaks of victory despite all evidence suggesting the war is lost. He doesn't ask for explanations, doesn't engage in discussion, simply states that the Führer demands immediate confirmation that demolitions have commenced, that Paris is being systematically destroyed, that you understand failure to comply constitutes treason, punishable by death, and dishonor to your family name. You hold the receiver away from your ear slightly, Model's voice reduced to tinny urgency, and you look again at your officers, at the city visible through the windows, at the demolition authorizations still unsigned on your desk. The moment extends, time moving strangely as it does when everything balances on the edge of irrevocable choice, when the next words you speak will set in motion sequences that cannot be recalled. You tell Model that technical difficulties are delaying implementation, that you're working to resolve issues with the detonation systems, that you expect to proceed within hours. The lies come easily, smoothly, your voice maintaining the professional tone that communicates nothing beyond competent management of operational challenges. Model accepts the explanation, with warnings about the consequences of further delay. Then the connection ends, and silence fills the room like water rushing into a void. Your chief of staff speaks first, his voice carefully neutral, asking what your actual intentions are, because the men need to know, because the situation is deteriorating too rapidly for ambiguity. You tell him the truth, speaking clearly so everyone hears, that you've decided Paris will not be destroyed, that the demolition authorizations will not be signed, that anyone who disagrees is free to report you to Berlin, but until relieved of command, you will not participate in obliterating a city for no military purpose. The response is not what you expected. No one objects, no one argues for following orders, no one invokes duty or regulations or the consequences of disobedience. Instead, you see relief on faces that had been tight with strain, see shoulders relax fractionally as if weight has been lifted, see men allowing themselves to acknowledge what they knew but couldn't say, that some orders deserve refusal regardless of cost. Hoffman speaks, your chief engineer, the man who spent weeks carefully positioning charges throughout the city's monuments and infrastructure. He says quietly that he's relieved, that the work of preparing Paris for destruction had troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate, that destroying in months what took centuries to create violated something fundamental about what engineering should mean. He volunteers to begin removing the charges, to disconnect the detonation systems, to undo the preparations that consumed so much time and effort. You authorize it, issuing orders that contradict Berlin but align with something deeper, some recognition that you're still capable of choosing preservation over destruction. The resistance contacts you again, Roltang sending word they're prepared to coordinate the transition of power, that they want to avoid unnecessary fighting in the streets, that French and American forces are willing to accept a formal surrender that allows your garrison to withdraw with dignity rather than be destroyed in place. The offer is practical, acknowledging that cornered forces fight desperately and that avoiding urban combat serves everyone's interests. You agree to meet, setting terms for ceasefire that your staff helps negotiate, the details of how an occupying force relinquishes control of a city it's held for 4 years. The bureaucracy of defeat mirrors the bureaucracy of conquest, the same attention to procedure and protocol applied to opposite purposes, as if maintaining proper forms matters even when the substance has dissolved. Paris celebrates around you before the surrender is even formalized, people emerging from buildings as news spreads that the city won't be destroyed, that liberation approaches without annihilation. You hear church bells ringing in violation of occupation regulations, hear crowds gathering in streets despite curfew, hear the sound of a city allowing itself to hope after years of suppression. From your window, you watch people embracing, crying, laughing, releasing emotions held carefully controlled through years of occupation. An old man stands on the corner below, waving a French flag that he must have hidden for 4 years, the fabric faded and creased, but unmistakably the tricolor that represented everything forbidden. A woman opens her shutters and begins singing the Marseillaise, her voice cracking with emotion, others joining until the street fills with the anthem you've suppressed. You feel disconnected from the celebration, aware that you're the enemy they're celebrating liberation from, that your decision not to destroy their city doesn't erase your role in occupying it. You don't expect gratitude or forgiveness, don't believe that preserving Paris balances the scales for Rotterdam or Sevastopol, or the countless smaller destructions your career includes. But you've stopped the machine, refused to add Paris to the list, chosen preservation when destruction was expected and ordered. Leclerc's forces arrive in the afternoon, tanks rolling through streets lined with cheering crowds, French soldiers returning to a city many haven't seen in 4 years. You watch the liberation from your window, witness the joy of reconnection, see what liberation means to people who've lived under occupation's weight. The scenes are chaotic and emotional, people climbing on the tanks, soldiers crying and embracing civilians, flowers thrown until the vehicles disappear under impromptu decoration. Your own surrender happens in your office, Leclerc arriving with staff officers and resistance leaders, the formality of documents signed and weapons relinquished. The French general is professional but cold, making clear that preserving Paris doesn't erase your occupation, doesn't make you admirable or worthy of special treatment. In the military vehicle taking you toward captivity, you have time to consider what you've done and what it means. You've disobeyed direct orders from the highest authority in the state you've served your entire adult life. You've chosen preservation of an enemy capital over loyalty to your own command structure. You've placed your judgment above the Führer's orders, violated everything military discipline teaches about obedience and duty. But you've also prevented a crime against civilization itself, refused to participate in destroying achievements that belong not just to France, but to humanity. Stopped the machine from grinding forward toward an outcome that would have served no one except perhaps the darkest impulses toward nihilistic destruction. You've saved bridges and monuments and neighborhoods, preserved spaces where human life can continue, where children can grow up surrounded by beauty rather than ruins. The cost will be substantial. You understand this clearly. Your reputation within Germany will be destroyed, labeled as traitor and coward, your family exposed to shame and possibly worse, depending on how the regime's final collapse unfolds. Your name will carry the stain of disobedience, of choosing enemy interests over German orders, of placing personal judgment above duty to the state. But your name will also be linked with Paris's survival, will appear in histories explaining how the city escaped the destruction planned for it, will represent the truth that individuals retain the power to refuse even when refusal seems impossible. The judgment of history matters less than you thought it would. What matters is knowing you made the choice you can live with, that when tested, you chose preservation
over destruction. The vehicle crosses the Seine, and you look back one last time at the city center, at the skyline still intact, at Paris enduring despite everything, and you feel something unexpected, something like peace. Not happiness or pride, you're too aware of your previous actions to feel those, but peace with this decision, certainty that whatever consequences follow, you chose correctly when it mattered most. You think of the old woman placing flowers on her husband's grave, of the children playing in the park, of the butcher sweeping his empty shop, of the countless individual lives that continue because you refused to sign authorizations that would have ended them. These people will never know your name, will never thank you, will never acknowledge that their survival depended on your choice. But they'll live. They'll continue their stories in this city that remains standing, and that continuation justifies whatever price you'll pay.
You reach for the telephone at precisely 0600 hours on August 25th. Your hand steady now, the trembling from yesterday replaced by the calm that comes after irreversible decisions are made. The number you dial connects you to your chief engineer, Hoffman, and when he answers, you hear the readiness in his voice, the expectation that finally the authorizations have come through, that finally the careful preparations will be put to use. Instead, you tell him to begin disconnecting the demolition charges, to make the bridges safe, to remove the explosives from Notre Dame and the Eiffel Tower and every other monument wired for destruction. The silence on the line stretches long enough that you wonder if the connection failed, but then Hoffman asks for confirmation, his engineering mind requiring precision, requiring certainty that he understood correctly. You repeat the order, adding that it comes with your full authority, that any subsequent orders contradicting this instruction should be ignored, regardless of claimed origin, that you are taking personal responsibility for this decision and its consequences. He acknowledges and disconnects, and you imagine him standing there in whatever office he occupies, trying to process how months of meticulous preparation are being undone in a single conversation. The morning light fills your office with that particular clarity that comes after storms, though the storm in this case hasn't arrived yet, still gathers on the horizon as Allied forces mass for their final push into the city. Your staff officers arrive for the daily briefing looking exhausted, men who've spent the night monitoring reports of desertions and resistance attacks and the steady compression of your defensive perimeter. You inform them that demolition operations are canceled, that Paris will be surrendered intact, and you watch their faces cycle through surprise and relief and fear as they calculate what this means for their own futures. Major Weber, your oldest subordinate and closest to what might be called a friend in this place, quietly asks what Berlin said when you informed them of this decision. You tell him the truth, that you haven't informed Berlin, that you're presenting them with a fait accompli, that by the time they could order you to reverse course, the charges will be disconnected, and the Allied forces will be entering the city, and the moment for destruction will have passed. He nods slowly, understanding that you've chosen a path that protects them from having to choose, that accepts sole responsibility for disobedience. The morning dissolves into a series of practical necessities, arrangements for ceasefire and surrender, and the complex choreography required to transfer power from one army to another without the chaos that kills people who survive the war only to die in its final moments. Nordling arrives to help negotiate the details, his diplomat skills finally finding full employment, his persistence over the past days vindicated by your decision, but his face showing no satisfaction,
only the focused attention of someone who understands that everything remains fragile until completed. The hotel looks different as you walk through its halls, a rich flavor of relief, a sense that something important has been saved from destruction. There is time, and in that time, the possibility for things to be repaired, for wounds to heal, for enemies to become friends. A small gift, but a gift nonetheless.
You think often about that morning of August 25, about the moment between reaching for the telephone and dialing Hoffman's number, about how the entire future pivoted on that small gesture. You think about the children playing in the park who are teenagers now, growing up in a Paris that almost wasn't, their lives unfolding in a city that exists because you made a choice. You think about the old woman visiting her husband's grave, who might have lost even that small connection if you'd signed different papers. The question that haunts you isn't whether you made the right choice regarding Paris. You know you did, can feel its rightness in ways that transcend argument or justification. The question that haunts you is why it took so long, why Rotterdam burned and Sevastopol fell before you found whatever capacity for refusal you discovered that August morning. You search your memory for the moment you changed, for the clear before and after that would explain the difference, but find only gradual accumulation, layers of experience building until something shifted. Perhaps that's the truth people don't want to hear, that there was no dramatic conversion, no moment of moral clarity that transformed you from obedient soldier to conscientious objector. Perhaps you simply reached the limit of what you could bear, found the boundary of your capacity for destruction, discovered that even highly trained military officers retain some core of humanity that eventually refuses to be further compressed. Perhaps the difference between following orders and refusing them is less about principle than about exhaustion, about reaching the point where the cost of obedience finally exceeds the cost of disobedience. You are released from prison in 1947, the tribunals having concluded that while you participated in war crimes, you also made choices that complicate simple narratives of guilt and innocence. You return to Baden and find your family older, changed by years of war and aftermath, and the particular burden of being connected to someone whose name carries historical weight. Your daughter, Anna, is 22 now, engaged to a teacher, building a life in a Germany trying to reconstruct itself from ruins, both physical and moral. You live quietly in the years that remain, avoiding publicity, declining interviews, trying to be simply a man rather than a historical figure. You walk in forests that survived the war, tend a small garden that produces vegetables according to the ancient rhythms of seasons and growth. You watch your grandchildren play and wonder what world they'll inherit, whether humanity learned anything from the catastrophe you participated in, or whether the lessons will need to be relearned at terrible cost. Paris continues without you, the city rebuilding what the war damaged, restoring what occupation degraded, remembering and forgetting in the complicated ways cities do. The bridges carry traffic, the monuments attract tourists, the streets fill with life that flows around and through the spaces you once occupied with the authority of an occupying general. You read sometimes about the city,
follow news of restoration projects and anniversary celebrations and the ongoing project of a place defining itself beyond its worst moments. You die in 1966, an old man in a quiet town, your life spanning enough history for several lifetimes, your choices examined and debated and interpreted by people who weren't there, who didn't stand at that window looking out at a city waiting for your decision. Your obituary struggle with how to summarize a life that contains both destruction and preservation, that can't be reduced to hero or villain without losing essential truth. But in Paris, in the city that exists because you refused an order, life continues in 10,000 ways that never reference your name or acknowledge your choice. The old woman who visited her husband's grave died years ago, but her daughter visits now, maintaining the connection across generations. The children who played in the park are parents themselves, walking their own children through the same spaces. The butcher's shop closed and reopened as a cafe where students gather to debate philosophy and politics and the meaning of history. The bridges still span the Seine, carrying millions across water that flows as it always has, indifferent to human drama, but essential to human life. The Eiffel Tower still rises against the sky, still the most recognizable silhouette in a city that remains recognizable because you found somewhere within yourself the capacity to choose preservation over destruction, to refuse an order when refusal required more courage than any battlefield valor. Your choice lives in the city that lives because of it, in the accumulated moments of ordinary beauty that cities make possible, in the fact that Paris continues to exist as Paris rather than as ruins rebuilding from rubble. The memorial isn't a statue or plaque, but the city itself, breathing and changing and enduring, proof that sometimes the right choice is possible, even in circumstances designed to make it impossible, that humanity can persist even in systems built to crush it, that individuals still matter even when machines seem to render individual choice irrelevant.